What's going on, you guys? Come on in, make yourselves at home. We're about to start a brand new episode of my show. It's called Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. If you're unfamiliar with my show, we have a good time. My name's Jimmy Moore. I talk about keto and fasting and cholesterol and health and nutrition and a partridge in a pear tree on this show. And lately been doing a lot about the COVID-19 and kind of how we're responding to this, some of the mindset types of things around that, and the emotional, the emotional concerns that people are having about all this and how they're handling it. So that's what I've been doing lately on this show. JimmyRants.com is the website. You can also access the videos over on YouTube. A lot of you guys watch this on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, hello YouTube, thanks for being here. On replay, you can see it there. Just type in the keyword Jimmy Rants in the search box over at YouTube. You will find the show. And then if you want to follow live, I am live on Instagram Live as well as simulcasting on Facebook Live. So Instagram Live, I'm at Livin' Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. And so go follow me. We go live at 11 a.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern on the weekends. And if I'm feeling spunky one day and I'm not too super tired, I do go at 5 p.m. occasionally during the week. I was going to try to do that last night, and about 4:30 last night, I got so just suddenly tired, like out of nowhere. I was like, what in the world? So I went and laid down, slept for a few hours, got up about 8 o'clock, and then was up a few hours and slept again. So I guess such is life. And no, I don't think I have COVID-19, but I just thought it was funny that I had planned on doing a Jimmy Rants at 5 yesterday, and it just didn't work out. So, but I am back with another Jimmy Rants, and it's not about COVID-19 today. It's about the 2020 Dietary Guidelines again. So I did one recently. I've done two recently on the Dietary Guidelines. Right about a week and a half ago, I talked about how this right before the COVID-19 thing kind of pushed us all in our houses and had to socially distance, there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. with some of the leading scientists looking at things like saturated fat and low-carb diets and things like that, along with some former members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and they came to the conclusion that there's enough evidence that there should be no limitations on saturated fat. Now, that was a consortium, so to speak, of people that are in the know, that have been involved with the process of making the dietary guidelines in the past. They're not a current part of the 2020 guidelines, which we'll hear about what the current members say, but these are former members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. These are scientists that are leading experts in their field looking at saturated fat. So that was out there. Then a few days ago, I did a Jimmy Rants about how the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee had promised to look at the low-carb research, but that they have decided they're probably not going to do a thorough study of it because they're throwing out all the studies related to weight loss because the dietary guidelines, their goal is not to help you lose weight. Did you know that, by the way? Like when people eat the guidelines, you don't realize, or do you realize that that's not designed to help you lose weight? People think it is. So they're discarding any low-carb studies, keto studies, that are looking at weight loss as the objective. And then they're also throwing out any studies that are related to any specific disease. And so any study looking at type 2 diabetes and keto, looking at heart disease and keto, any kind of health ailment and keto, they're dismissing it entirely. So what's left is a very incomplete picture of what the data actually is. But they pretty much said, oh, we're not even going to look at it. And now that this coronavirus thing hit, they're really not interested. Well, guys, I have brand new information here today. And I do have the Nutrition Coalition, Nina Teicholz and her group, to thank for this information here today about the 2020 dietary guidelines, because they are trying, and this is no lie, they are trying to lower the cap on saturated fat. Now, The 2015 Dietary Guidelines put a cap on saturated fat at 10% of total calories or less. That's the highest it's been in years. Back in the 80s, I want to say they kept it at around like 7%. Then they pushed it a little bit higher, like I said, 5 years ago. Well, now they're trying to go backwards again. And you're not going to believe why. You're not going to believe what one of the members of the committee that's determining our dietary guidelines, what he said about saturated fat. Just you wait. It's shocking. All right. In March, at the last and final meeting of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, members suggested that they'd like to lower the cap on saturated fat even further. So currently it's 10% of your calories, down to 7, and hold on to your hats, you guys. Some have proposed on that committee that it should be 0. No saturated fat at all. Now, let me tell you what that's code for. When you've got members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee saying we should have 0 saturated fat, it means they don't want you eating meat, animal foods. Don't think that that's not what this means at all. And these people are ruthless, thinking that they're going to get away with telling people don't eat any saturated fat at all. The shocking thing is there's some things that are pretty darn healthy, even for like vegans, that have lots of saturated fat. Coconut oil, for example. So are we suddenly getting rid of not just meat and animal-based foods, but coconut oil? And how do you remove saturated fat from a real food that's a naturally occurring part of that real food? How do you remove the saturated fat if the goal is 0? We're going to get back to the 0 thing here in a minute. These ideas are entirely contrary to the steady, growing consensus among top researchers over the past decade that all these caps that we've seen on saturated fat were never based on any strong science, and they should be reconsidered. And it's true. You ask the average everyday person, is saturated fat healthy or unhealthy? And I'm going to tell you, probably 8 out of 10 people, maybe 9 out of 10 people are going to say saturated fat is decidedly unhealthy. Then you ask them why. Well, it raises your cholesterol, it clogs your arteries, it gives you heart disease, and you die of cancer. Because these are all the things that have been put out there in the media surrounding definitely consuming red meat, but consuming saturated fat in general. But the shocking thing is these things have never been shown in studies. We've never seen a randomized controlled clinical trial that shows the saturated fat is anything of the sort of how it's described. And yet most people believe it's this harmful substance because they hear it from their doctors. They hear it in advertising. Oh, you need to lower your saturated fat to prevent heart disease. I think the one I saw the other day, there was a Honey Nut Cheerios commercial on. Oh, you need to eat Honey Nut Cheerios because it's heart healthy. No, processed grains are not heart healthy. I can assure you of that. But they're heart healthy according to the American Heart Association because they're low in saturated fat and because they have healthy whole grains. You see how messed up our thinking is about what's healthy and what's not healthy? A recent panel of senior scientists from the US, Canada, and Denmark sent a letter, and this is what I was talking about on my Jimmy Rants about a week and a half ago, to the USDA and HHS, where they request to give serious and immediate consideration to lift the limits on saturated fat for the upcoming 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This request is based on a review of the most rigorous scientific data. Making recommendations based on anything but the most rigorous science is likely to have unintended or even potentially harmful consequences to health. Guys, if they're able to convince people still in 2020 with the mountains of evidence that we've seen in support of having saturated fat in your diet, if they still ignore it, why? You have to go to motivation at that point. In the face of very clear science, not epidemiology, not animal-based models, not statistical analysis, not any of the things that get the flashy headlines. Randomized control clinical trials. That is the grand poobah of all research. And if the grand poobah of all research shows there's a whole lot of nutting when it comes to the supposed harmful effects of saturated fat, why, pray tell, are we putting limits on said nutrient? It's crazy. This group of prominent scientists, which included 3 former members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, including the 2005 committee chair, said they're working towards publishing their findings in a journal. So these guys got together and they're like, hey, we did an examination. They did what's called a meta-analysis, where they looked at all these different studies. And looking at all these studies, they found there was a whole lot of nothing that showed that saturated fat was somehow harmful for you. So they're like, why do we have these arbitrary restrictions on saturated fat if there is no science to support that? Members of the 2020 subcommittee on dietary fats and seafood, responsible for the reviews on saturated fats, however, seem to be unaware of the recent evolution in the science on saturated fats. Get ready, you guys. You're about to lose your mind. Because these are people that are actually on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And when you hear what they had to say about saturated fat, it's going to blow your mind. The committee relied heavily on what the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee review did in 2010 and 2015, and all they've done is forwarded those looking at the science forward. They didn't look at any of the new science, guys. Which, if you're an American and you're caring about health and caring about the nutritional information that's being put out there to the public of what's healthy based on science, does that bother you that they didn't even take the time to want to look at the new research that has come out? That's literally the only reason why we update these guidelines every 5 years, is so that the new science can be more closely examined. And if they're not even going to look at what science has come out even in the past 5 years, much less the last 10 years, and they're just going to default back to what the science was and the review of the science was in 2010 and 2015, somebody's not doing their job. And it's even worse than that. Let me keep reading. Indeed, members of the subcommittee sought to push the cap on saturated fats even lower than they ever have before. So one of the members of this Dietary Guidelines Committee is this guy named Jamie Ard. I want you to see his face. There's Jamie Ard. Okay, Jamie Ard. And this is one of the guys that was taking a look at all of the saturated fat data that is out there. And he asked this question. I still can't believe he did this. Why should it not be 0, referring to the saturated fat recommendation? Jamie, you're a friggin' idiot. If you think 0 saturated fats is somehow a good idea, like, I get it, people buy into the notion that saturated fat is some grand enemy in your health. But when you know what good saturated fat does for you, which we'll get into in a second, you know what good it does? The idea of saying 0 intake? What? Like, literally, what? We know that saturated fat is not an essential nutrient. Okay. Dr. Ard, oh my... why does it take a layperson like Jimmy Moore to call out this BS? Yes, I'm a more educated layperson than most that are just casually watching. But still, is he insane to think that saturated fat's not an essential nutrient and that we should really cut it down to 0 as the recommendation for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines? Is he really making that claim? Yes, he is. Guess what? Guess what Dr. Ard's ties are to the food companies? Dr. Ard is the medical director of Nestle Incorporated. What does Nestle make? A lot of crappy garbage. They do. It's one of the world's biggest junk food manufacturers. But Dr. Ard was not alone in his criticism of saturated fat. It was also echoed by one of his fellow members on the advisory committee, Linda Van Horn. And so I've got a partial picture of Linda Van Horn. There she is. There she is. So Linda Van Horn also echoed the same sentiments all about saturated fat. And she is a longtime saturated fat foe. She thinks saturated fat is the main reason people get sick and have chronic disease in this country. She's argued against having people consume saturated fat for decades. Neither one of these people that are on this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee seem to realize that saturated fat is so important in your metabolic health. One of the major things saturated fat does, you guys, there's no drug that will do this, but saturated fat uniquely does one really good thing on your cholesterol panel. You know, we hear all about raising LDL cholesterol, raising total cholesterol, but guess what it does raise? It raises HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol. Everybody agrees HDL is the good cholesterol. Well, what's the best way to raise HDL? If you've got low HDL, the best way to do it is go eat you some saturated fat. So if we take these guys' recommendations to eliminate saturated fat consumption altogether, how, pray tell, do you raise your HDL cholesterol, which is heart healthy? Plus, this saturated fat is an integral part of many whole foods, things like meat and dairy, and it's bioavailable protein that comes along with it, the essential nutrients like amino acids, the complete proteins. All these nutrients that are in there. When you look at a breakdown of the most nutritious foods on the planet, literally the top 20 are all animal-based foods. Kale doesn't even crack the top 20. Acai berries don't crack the top 20. None of these so-called superfoods crack the top 20. It's all meat and animal-based foods. If that doesn't tell you something about nutrient density, then I don't know what does. Which makes Dr. Ard and Dr. Van Horn and their position about saturated fat so incredibly asinine. Are you guys getting upset by this? Like, these are the people in charge of trying to tell us what is healthy for us, and they are so jaded. They're so biased that they can't even see science that supports the opposite of what they're saying. All of these nutrients that are found in animal foods are vitally important for growth and disease prevention. Van Horn says she wants 7% or less on saturated fat because that's what the American Heart Association calls for. Don't get me started on the AHA. They have not been about helping you with heart health. They pretend like they are. They pretend like they're all about helping people with heart disease and prevent heart attacks and blah, blah, blah. They pretend, but let's not fool ourselves. The AHA is a shill group. They're another shill for big food. They are. This group addresses only those with the risk for heart disease and not the entire population, talking about the AHA. Moreover, the AHA has long been questioned for the 20% plus funding it gets from the food and drug companies. You ever been in a store, probably not right now because of coronavirus, but when you're in a store and you go down like the cereal aisle, for example, look on the box and you'll see like this little heart symbol. That's the American Heart Association's heart health symbol. They don't put that on there for free, you guys. Kellogg's, Post, all these companies that put out this crap, they're all paying the American Heart Association to put this little heart health symbol on there to signify that this is a food that they think is heart healthy, primarily because it's low in saturated fat. And so they get paid. 1 out of every $5 that they get is from food companies and pharmaceutical companies. Now, why would the pharmaceutical companies give money to the American Heart Association? What is one of the top selling like heart drugs out there, or at least trying to protect your heart? It's statin medications. And I just did a Jimmy Rants on this last night. Statins make $30 billion a year. So, of course they want the American Heart Association telling people, don't eat saturated fat, because we need people to be on our drugs. This is crazy. Like, if they're really trying to look at science, they are letting us down. Big Pharma, for interest, is heavily invested in those drugs that I just talked about. Thus, it's extremely important to note that the cardiovascular benefits from cholesterol lowering via drugs has never been replicated at all when you try to lower your cholesterol by diet. So they always tell people, eat this cereal like the Honey Nut Cheerios I was talking about earlier. Oh, it's good for your cholesterol, drops it 20 points or whatever. What they don't tell you is the studies that show that there might be a benefit from the drugs lowering your cholesterol is not the same as lowering your cholesterol through a crappy diet. And what we do know about statin drugs, for example, is the drug is not the cholesterol lowering effects of like a statin medication like Lipitor, Crestor, those kinds of drugs. It's not the cholesterol lowering that they think gives you the benefit. It's the inflammation lowering, and there's that I word again. Inflammation is at the heart of all disease, you guys. And as soon as we forget that it's about the inflammation, and we just think it's, just lower cholesterol. Well, cholesterol is just an innocent bystander in this whole thing. Inflammation is the real key here. And so a statin, yes, can show an anti-inflammatory effect, but why do a statin with all the side effects and all the increased risks of chronic disease when you could just eat a diet and do some lifestyle things that are, anti-inflammatory as well, right? In fact, in nearly a dozen large trials on diet, researchers found that when you lower your cholesterol by restricting saturated fat, it had a minimal effect on cardiovascular death, while at the same time reliably raising the risk of death from cancer. So, if we do what these doctors on this subcommittee for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans want us to do, cutting saturated fat down to 7%, Dr. Van Horn said that, or we go back to this nincompoop Jamie Ard. Dr. Ard wants us to go to 0 because saturated fat is an irrelevant nutrient in the diet. You don't need it. If we did that, there's no change in the deaths from people having cardiovascular issues, and you get the bonus of possibly dying because you get cancer. These people, they are like shills for these companies. And to what end? Where are the people that are standing up for public health, for you and me? Where are those people when we need them? These people in positions of power who have authority to have a real effect on our health. They have let us down bad. Despite this, the 2020 subcommittee stated that it found the link between saturated fat and heart disease to be strong for both adults and children. There's never been any evidence, any solid, strong evidence that shows that there is a link between saturated fat and heart disease. It just don't exist. Show me the randomized control clinical trial. Don't show me epidemiology. That's not valid. Don't show me animal-based models. A lot of them look at like mice and rabbits. A rabbit's diet is mostly like a vegetarian type of diet, and yet they force feed this saturated fat to rabbits, and then they get heart disease. And see, that's what happens to humans when they eat a lot of saturated fat. They get heart disease. I'm like, I'm not Bugs Bunny. What's up, doc? No, I'm not Bugs Bunny. Like, come on. Right? In addition to the issues noted above, we find these reviews by the subcommittee to be flawed in a number of ways. The analysis on adults used as its starting point, the review on saturated fats from 2015, It was criticized by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine for being non-systematic. A separate peer review analysis in the BMJ found that this review relied heavily on outside organizations that got major contributions from food and drug companies, and also that the conclusions did not accurately fit the evidence. Guys, the influence of the money being made by big food companies and big pharmaceutical companies, we cannot discount that they're having a major effect, a silencing effect on what the actual science is showing. And if you didn't already know that, please put it on your radar screen loud and clear. This is why these dietary guidelines have always been a joke, but they're not funny, because these guidelines, while you may ignore them individually, personally, they have tentacles all throughout our society, which I've talked about before. The review on children relied on two trials, the DISC and the STRIP. Both of them were in the 1990s. They're deeply flawed as a basis for population-wide recommendations, because the DISC subjects have been selected for their unusually high cholesterol levels, meaning they probably had a genetic predisposition for higher cholesterol. And so thus you can't extrapolate what happens there to the whole population. It's kind of like those people who use these extremely sick epileptic children from the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. There was a lot of research on the ketogenic diet and those epileptic children. And so because they were very sick epileptic children trying to control their seizures with a ketogenic diet, any kind of side effect that happened in their health, they extrapolated it was because of the keto when they were very sick. And so I remember back when I was in the paleo community, there was a big talk from the main stage about why ketogenic diet is dangerous. Sarah Ballantyne gave that talk. And she relied on all of that data from the 1920s, looking at epileptic children and saying, oh, look, this is what happened to them. So therefore, healthy individuals today are going to have the same thing happen. And I'm going, no, that's not how it works, Sarah. Nice try, though. Then in the STRIP study, subjects were all Finnish, all of them under the age of 3. These unusual study groups cannot be used as a basis for adults or children. It doesn't apply. These were very sick children. Moreover, the DISC children consumed a low-fat diet, failed to meet basic nutritional standards, and this has been found in other studies when they were also fed a low-fat diet. Finally, there's never been any evidence to show that cholesterol lowering in children will translate into better heart disease outcomes later in life. Indeed, we actually have ample evidence to show children need far more need fat, more naturally occurring proteins than adults do, because it helps in their growth and development and is harmed when these foods are reduced. So if we're telling kids, cut your fat down 7%, even 0%, we're going to stunt the growth of kids, stunt the intelligence, stunt the brain growth. Like literally, your brain is 70% fat. When you don't consume enough fat, you think we got mood issues now? When you don't consume enough dietary fat, and saturated fat is a part of that. Yes, there are monounsaturated, there's polyunsaturated, I get it. But saturated fats are a just as critical part of your health. And so if we let them get away with this, kids are going to suffer. So Nina Teicholz in her article says, it is highly problematic that Dr. Van Horn, who was a lead author of this study, she was the lead author of the DISC study. She did not recuse herself from the discussion on the study's merits in the proceedings, and on the contrary, she actually became the most vocal proponent of using the data and used it to push for further lowering of capsule and saturated fat. Guys, the wolf is running the hen house. Literally, the wolf is running the hen house here. And people are so oblivious to this. Now, I get it. Right now, we're in the midst of kind of something that's distracting us from paying attention. But if you're not paying attention to this, they're using this distraction right now because they think nobody's paying attention. and they think they're going to get away with this. And it's criminal. Like, we need to have an uproar in Washington, D.C. about this. Get the friggin' dietary guidelines outside the purveyorship of the government, because they have flubbed it up badly. They're not even looking at the science. Finally, the subcommittee noted limitations on the studies used to support its conclusions, namely that the majority of the studies did not control for all the confounding variables. Many studies did not have cardiovascular disease as a primary outcome. These limitations are significant enough to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of any of the review of the data. All right. So in the discussion period that followed this presentation, the vice chair of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, Ronald Kleinman, he brought up some findings, and he noted that it had reached the opposite conclusion, that saturated fat in the diet does not impact your heart disease or your stroke. So then they responded to that. Dr. Van Horn and others all responded to that using vague terms. Listen to this, guys. One of the subcommittee members, Joan Sabate, said the clinical trials on saturated fats were complicated by refined carbohydrates. All the major clinical trials on these fats keep carbs constant, swapping out only sat fat for polyunsaturated vegetable oils, implying that Sabate's comment was an error. Interesting, huh? Then committee chair Barbara Schneeman also emphasized that these trials lower LDL cholesterol, which she describes as an intermediary outcome. However, the far more definitive hard outcome data, such as heart attack, stroke, and death, showed that saturated fat restriction had no positive benefit. So focusing on the intermediary outcomes rather than the long-term hard outcomes is like judging the performance of a marathoner at the halfway mark rather than the finish line. I know we're missing sports right now, a lot of us, so imagine you go and you have a football game and my cat is... What are you doing? Ginger, or Peaches, shut up. She does this every time I do Jimmy Rants. Real life, you guys. See, they're tired of being sequestered in this house too. Sorry, I'm trying to remember where I was. It's like playing a football game, and you get to halftime, and the score is 13-10. So is that the end of the game? Do we stop the game? No, you play a second half. You get the full data, you get the full game, and then you find out who wins in the end. Can you imagine if that was used in the Super Bowl where the Patriots came back and beat the Atlanta Falcons a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago? The Falcons were beating the crap out of the Patriots, and then they came back in the second half and won the game. The Patriots did. As mentioned, any intermediary LDL lowering effects do not matter when it comes to the more definitive outcomes of heart attacks and death. The latter data is much more reliable and ultimately what one wants to know. Does reducing saturated fat limit one's chances of having a heart attack or dying from heart disease? The clinical trial data does not support this. So Nina Teicholz says it's deeply concerning that not one single member of the subcommittee on dietary fats raised any objections to its strong conclusions, despite the obvious widespread scientific debate in this field. This suggests that the committee is completely unbalanced and one-sided. See, we pretend like the people that are on that committee have no agenda. And I'm here to argue that I think everybody who is appointed to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee have a major agenda. Most of them have ties to the food companies, ties to the pharmaceutical companies. We need independent guidelines, and this is proof positive of it. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, in its critique of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory process, suggests that bias be managed within the committee, but then on the subject of saturated fats, this kind of management has simply not taken place, as we've been describing here today. So, nutritioncoalition.org is the website where I got all of this. Let me just double check that, make sure. Yeah, so go to nutritioncoalition.org or just Google Nutrition Coalition. You can find out how you can get involved and make your voice heard. The problem, I'm sorry, it's nutritioncoalition.us. Sorry, I said .org. .us, nutritioncoalition.us. And so you can make your voice heard about the dietary guidelines. But guys, like every time we think we take 2 steps forward or 1 step forward, we take 2 steps back. Like when they put the saturated fat at 10% for the 2015 dietary guidelines, we're like, oh, thank God, maybe by 2020 we'll get it up to 15%. And, why is this important? Because, you're probably thinking, well, I'm eating keto. I don't care what they say in the guidelines. Well, it literally does go into every part of our society. Military commissaries, food stamp programs, public schools. I mean, you name it. The tentacles of this do go deep and wide in our culture. And so if we have bad information that's formulated on the basis of looking at all the science, but it's not really looking at all the science, then you got dietitians and doctors and all these people parroting this stuff, and people, oh my gosh, well, that's from the government. They did a rigorous review of all the data. This must be the most up-to-date, accurate information, and it couldn't be more wrong. So I'm not going to stop giving you this kind of information because I think you, as a consumer, need to know when Sally down the road talks about, oh yeah, the saturated fat's going to clog your artery. You need to know that when you hear it and how it's articulated and how there's supposedly smart people on this committee saying, oh, well, saturated fat's not really an essential nutrient at all, and we should just make it 0, that should put on like radar, and just what? All right, let's see what you guys have to say. Welcome in. We're going to go to Instagram Live first, and we'll pop over to Facebook if we have time. And as always, I can't see you over there on the Living La Vida Low Carb Facebook page, but thanks for being here. We'll look at your comments when we're done here today. Welcome in. Thanks for being here today on Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website, so check it out. Brittany says 0 saturated fat is asking for more chronic disease. See, here's the thing, Brittany. When you don't eat saturated fat, and I don't know about you guys, but when I consume saturated fat, it is literally the satiety game changer for me. Like, if I'm not eating saturated fat and I'm only able to have mono unsaturated or, God forbid, some polyunsaturated fats, I don't get satiated from them. The only thing that gives me great satiation in the form of fat is saturated fat. And it usually is all bound up in some meat. It's the saturated fat that's found naturally in eggs. Saturated fat is where the satiety is. So are they trying to make people more hungry? Well, guess what? When you're hungry and you can't eat saturated fat, they know you're going to eat more carbohydrate. Hafersi says fat is not a nutrient. Exactly. That's what they think. They think fat is not a nutrient. Like saturated fat, there is this thing called essential fatty acids. Essential, meaning the body don't make them. And so if the body doesn't make it, how are you supposed to get it? You've got to get it in your diet, right? I'm disgusted with these people, says, hey, diet. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, we all are just flabbergasted. These are supposed to be the most brilliant minds in the world when it comes to nutrition, and they've let us down, guys. Like, again, I'm going to point out, I am a layperson. I ain't a PhD, MD, RD, or any D after my name. I'm just a dude who's trying to educate people on how we're being bamboozled, right? And if you're being fooled, it's going to make you go down a bad road and make bad decisions for your health. Bonnie says, can they somehow make the farmers take the fat out of the meat or chemically do it like they do with things that would be so bad? Well, think about, Bonnie, how they make skim milk and then like all the lean meats that they make, and they throw away all that extra fat. So yeah, you're onto something there. If they got, I mean, this is not mandated where you absolutely couldn't eat saturated fat. But here's the thing. If people are on food stamps, they can't buy saturated fat. If they're in a public school, they won't serve your kids saturated fat. If it's a military commissary, they won't sell saturated fat. If it's 0 is the limit, they won't sell it to you. This is big, guys. Brittany says, I'm truly over the keto is dangerous talk. It's so old and outdated. Come up with a new excuse. Brittany, I've been listening to that about low carb diets in general since 2004. That's when I did it. And so I feel your pain, girl, because, and it's so funny because the playbook has never changed. It's exactly the same arguments as it was 15, 16 years ago. Now we're talking about kids. You really are going to bring out my spicy side. Yeah, we don't want Brianka out here today, Brittany. She said, my 7-year-old struggles with ADHD tendencies always after eating junk food. Birthdays, Christmas, Halloween, but when I have her on high fat and low sugar, she absolutely thrives. Yep. George says, Peaches wants her own ranch. Yeah, Peaches, she's got a bad habit of like going in the other room and then just... I'm like, shut up. Brittany says there's such fear around cholesterol. People think it's all bad. They don't realize cholesterol is needed to make hormones. Hormones control so much within our bodies. Yeah, my last Jimmy Rants, I talked all about cholesterol and how it's needed. Brittany agrees with me that saturated fat is needed for satiety. And when aiming to lose weight, I drop much faster when consuming sat fat. Yeah, most of us do. Alrighty, yes, Brianka coming out in full force today, isn't it, Brittany? So, all right, let's go over here to Facebook, see what you guys have to say. Welcome in, welcome in. Thanks for being here today on Jimmy Rants. Katrina says, finally able to catch you live. Homeschooling is keeping this mama busy. Hey, I bet. And kudos to you for doing that. I got a text yesterday on my phone from a mom, and it was something along the lines of, I posted this on my stories on Instagram yesterday, but it was something along the lines of, well, if you get 2 papers written today, I've got a special surprise in store for you when I get home. And so I'm like, okay, I know that's a mom trying to help their kids get their work done. So I had some fun with her. I said, I want to know what the prize is first before I do the work. And then I was like, oh, I think you meant to send this to your kids, but you're a very good mom for bribing them like you're doing. So she got a kick out of that. Oh, Brenda, I knew you would bring an F-bomb on this one. Yes, this is true. I promise you. Serena says they are stuck in the past. I guess the science was settled, just like cigarettes are healthy for pregnant women. Hey, that used to be true in people's minds. Chris says, can't they be sued for child endangerment? Yeah, I mean, kids, they need that saturated fat. I mean, I think about the ones that thrive the most. Like you hear about these kids that eat real food, have naturally occurring fats in food. They're brilliant. Like they really exceed well. Their mood stays calm. It's magic what eating saturated fat does for their brains. So why would we harm them? Why would we do that? Terry Lee, zero is just stealing from us. The Fiberati are in business to do what makes them as much money as they can. You're all over the board. I'm trying to read this straight and it doesn't read. So more variety of products. So think, what do they do with the zero fat yogurt? How do they use the fat they removed? We know they replaced with sugar and other undesirables. Where's the fat to say 2% milk? Where is that used? It's not like meat where they trim the visible fat. I consider low-fat products as stealing from me. Well, low-fat products, you want to talk about processed foods. To make a food low-fat is incredibly processed food. So it's always amazed me that that's been glorified as health food. Even like look at all these like fake meat burgers now. You look at the chemical crap storm that is the ingredients list of like the Beyond Meat burgers, and you're like, what? Like this is glorified as healthy, but beef for ground beef is unhealthy? That doesn't make sense. Chrissy says, what can we do? nutritioncoalition.us, they have little resources on there about how you can contact your congressman and ask them to really reconsider looking at this science, because there is no science that supports that saturated fat is harmful. Food betrayal, don't swallow the lies. Apparently this is a YouTube video that Terry Lee, so look up Food Betrayal, Don't Swallow the Lies by Alan Lewis. Cool. Serena says the conflict of interest are insidious with these groups, and they just bounce back and forth. They're on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and then when their time is up, they go and work for Nestle, and they will go and work for Big Food here, Big Food there. They go to the pharmaceutical companies. Then when it comes time for the next Dietary Guidelines in 2025, who can we pull in? Let's get the medical advisor for Nestle and stick them on the... You see how it's this revolving door of special interests. Yep. I'm on the Nutrition Coalition website. Where can we give our opinion? So it should be pretty clear. I know at the end here, it did say go to nutritioncoalition.us/take, T-A-K-E, dash ACTION, action. Take dash action. So nutritioncoalition.us/take dash action is where you can go. Love seeing your face today. Thank you, Marie. I love doing Jimmy Rants. It's a lot of fun. Serena says, I guess nuts and olive oils are the bad food list now. This is insane. Well, nuts and olive oil do not have saturated fat. Those are mostly mono and polyunsaturated fats. Their main objective in opposing saturated fat is they're trying to get people to stop eating meat. And I think that's a dangerous proposition. Debbie says, you sounded like Jim Carrey in Cable Man with the kitty sound. Jim Carrey? Oh, Cable Guy. Did Jim Carrey go... I don't remember that part of that movie. Oh, Debbie. And if you remember Cable Guy, then yeah, you're of a certain age, that's for sure. So guys, the bottom line in this Jimmy Rants is stuff's happening. And I'm trying to keep things on your radar screen. I know we're all consumed by what's going to happen, the uncertainty with the COVID-19 coronavirus, but let's not pretend like life isn't going on. Let's not pretend like that a lot of these things that we think will just be pushed to the side. Dietary guidelines are still coming out this year. And this will be our guidelines for the next 5 years. And every time we feel like we're making progress with the dietary guidelines, along comes something stupid like this, where one of the advisory committee members says that saturated fat should be 0. What is he thinking? He's not. He did when he was fighting with Matthew. Okay. All right, guys, let me pop off of here. I have a podcast to record in an hour, Real Talk, with Dr. Berkowitz and Dr. Cole. So we got to get to that here and get ready for that. But thank you for being here today on Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website to access all the past episodes. Be sure to check that out. Also, YouTube, type in a keyword, Jimmy Rants. And as always, go follow me over on Instagram. I'm at Livin' Low Carb Man. LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Engage in the content. I try to put out some good stuff over there in general as well on my regular page and in my stories. And stay tuned, guys. Like, there's so much to talk about still. I'll get back to some of the COVID-19 stuff soon. I got some keto things. I got another Ask Me Anything coming up later this week as well. So lots of content for you. Thanks for watching. And until next time, we'll see you then. All right.